Okay, hi everyone. So as already said, I'm Chris Roberts. Tonight's talk is People-Driven-Agile, and it is based around experiences at Home Office Digital. So a very whirlwind introduction on myself. So that is a much better presented guy than me, but let's pretend that's me for a second. Imagine I'm dressed a bit sharper and I've got some sort of comb over thing going on. So I've had a range of roles over the last 10 years. I started out doing traditional project management. I then started to follow my people instincts and actually learn a lot more about Agile. I sort of tended to move post-its around without actually knowing what I was doing with it. So I then sort of got into a Scrum Master role. I was doing a lot of that, delivering projects. So you get a lot of these funny titles like Agile Project Manager as well. Lots of debate in the industry. I then sort of moved on to wanting to really focus on working with people, transferring knowledge, stuff I'd learned to people who were going through, say, an Agile transformation, which you probably noticed there's a lot of those about. Also done quite a bit of Kanban coaching recently, which people may debate is or isn't Agile, but labels aside, essentially I just like to help people work more effectively. I think that's what it's about. So the goal of today's talk is just to share an experience with you, really, not all sort of case studies, field reports, mention of stuff from the trenches. I'm going to tell you a bit of a story. Forget all that. It's a story, and it's just a bit of an experience since I've come into Home Office Digital in the last 6 months. So, a bit of a rare situation. This was my first day, and it was the sort of startup that isn't a startup. It was going into Home Office Digital in Sheffield, which was a totally new startup. The Home Office Digital existed in London, but across the road in Sheffield, 3,000 of the operational side of the business still do a lot of visa application forms. They push a lot of paper trolleys around. They've got a lot of needs, and they're not really being surfaced due to capacity by the guys in London. So a bit of a scary fact I learnt on my first day is that they could at any one time have 50,000 physical passports in the building. And 2016, it's a bit of a wake-up call. So I went in there expecting, maybe a little bit cynical. I'd not had a great perception of public sector work or government work. I'd done it on the supplier side when we'd helped deliver products or services. But the intention here is to actually build across the road from some of our internal users, and actually we get a lot of visa applicants visiting some of the processing centres, an ongoing capability in Sheffield and a base outside of London. So, mentioned the weird situation about it being a startup. So it's a rare opportunity because not only was it a startup where we had this sort of challenge of I was the second person through the door and I was wearing different hats, so any 1 minute I might be starting to, whilst we were recruiting, facilitating a user story mapping session, writing stories for a product backlog, doing some research with end users. I'd also be trying to recruit, trying to shape out what sort of culture and values we wanted. But we had the opportunity, which I don't think you get very much, certainly in the public sector, to be able to shape something from scratch, to not sort of walk in and it's like, okay, well, this is how we do things around here. So that was all around. I've listed a few things, broadly speaking. So culture, governance. You probably might have some nightmares if you imagine what the sort of cliche or the stereotype of public sector governance is, and also ways of working. And so I'd got a bit of a bee in my bonnet around culture anyway, because I think wherever I've gone to work, whether it's been a big corporate environment or working with a small little startup agency or a digital agency, there's always been a bit of a misinterpretation about culture. So we often think, oh, it's that we get on with the person who sits next to us, or I can talk about the football, or somebody I can go for a drink with. Whereas actually culture's misunderstood. We're talking about shared values and an actual belief system within a set of people, whether it be a team, a department or an organisation. So, a couple of us who were first in through the door had what was an initial vision for what might the culture be like. And this is all quite high level, and until you start working with people, there's a lot of things you might expect on there. There's a lot of cliches at this sort of level, there are going to be, but a key thing, especially for the public sector, was this one here, this flat structure. The organisation over the road had a very different culture. The operational side of the business, it was very hierarchical. It was very, do you speak to somebody if they're 2 grades above you? You know, making decisions, it felt very unnatural. So we had an opportunity here to be able to do something different, to almost sort of not have a hierarchy, still be able to have leaders, but anybody could contribute. So that's all well and good, but the sort of ongoing challenge whilst starting to do a bit of discovery work on our first product, which was actually looking at online visa application forms, was actually getting a team together. So this was an in parallel challenge. So after a bit of networking, aside from all the user facing stuff I was doing and using sort of knowledge of the Sheffield scene and some of my colleagues who I knew as well, we got a team in to work on this first product. We got it pretty fast. A key thing that we wanted to get across was we always wanted a product owner who was a permanent member of staff and knew actually the operational side of the business. So I don't know what experiences you've all had, but I think companies of a certain size, you always get this business and IT thing, and the opposite ends of the spectrum, and you're desperately trying to get them somewhere near here. What we wanted was somebody who had, you know, some skin in the game, who understood how visas worked, how people case worked, applications, what the pain points were, what all these crazy disparate systems and ways you couldn't even imagine of doing reporting and stuff panned out in reality. So getting a team together is great, but we've got some initial challenges there, especially when this hub initially is a bit of a proof of concept that we can do something like this up north for Home Office Digital. So a key thing to do at first was to run a team inception day. These carry varying forms. You might have heard this type of activity before. For us, it was a half-day session. We've got some pretty experienced Agile people who we'd actually recruited in. We'd also got some people who were permanent or transferred from the operational side of the business, and part of the culture thing there was that if they had the right attitude and willingness to learn, we'd always take that above some genius that was a jerk that nobody could work with. So we had a quick session there where we'd like refresh on what the basics of Agile are in terms of not only the cultural values but the actual working practices, and then how we deliver stuff early and often. We also covered some Kanban stuff, so some basics around Kanban, around just in time, theory of constraints, how we wanted to enable flow and not let people multitask. But importantly, a lot of these guys hadn't worked in public sector before, and certainly not for the Home Office, so it was a very quick get in sync, not only with Agile and ways of working, but actually with, okay, this is what the Home Office does, this is going to be our first product. We have to align quite closely. I don't know if you've heard of GDS, Government Digital Services, that are online at gov.uk, which is very focused on stuff like user-centered design, stripping it way back to basics. We had to get everyone up to speed pretty quickly. And I guess most importantly, the guys just had to get to know each other. When you throw a load of people together, if you hit a jackpot, they all just start sort of communicating like that, and there's no barriers, but often the different types of people, different types of characters, even people in different types of roles tend to have different personas, so we had to break down the barriers and get them up to speed quite quickly. So, a little exercise, maybe Glenn from our experience in another role might recognise, was just we buddied people up, and we we do a quick exercise that always gets a giggle if nothing else, and breaks a bit of the ice when you have to sort of sketch each other, especially like sort of at a distance, looks a little bit like a brain. So it's essentially just saying, okay, who are you? Let me get to know you for 2 minutes. I'll draw you, I'll ask you some questions, and I'll do like a team profile. This is as well surprisingly accurate, even though it looks like it's trying to imitate a bit of a caveman vibe, but he does wear clothes. So I mentioned we had some vision for what we wanted the culture to be like, but that's all well and good. We've got some people here now, some people who we're going to start working with, who are really going to buy into this. So we then turn that high level vision into 6 core team values. Okay, so we had a concept basically of, if something's not working, let's speak up. We might can it or we might change it. If it's a discovery on a product and we think, why are we even doing this? Then just because we've started it, we don't have to finish it. There's no need to carry on. Or if we're having stand-ups for some reason at 7:45 on every day, and somebody's can't make it in before 9, then it's obvious, let's just change it. So we just say, speak up straight away and really encourage anyone to get their opinions across. A second one, and this is a bit of a luxury, and people are making distributed teams work a lot better now than they were, say, 15 years ago. But essentially, we had people who were located in different areas, but we got teams to sit together with the product owner, who was sort of, often people would move over from the operational side of the business to come and sit with us, but that was a real key thing. It just means you can talk across a desk pretty easily. You're not sort of getting into that bad habit where you start getting into email trails. Of course, the sort of the 4 walls, is a bit of a limitation in terms of the wider world, but in this team environment, there was no reason why everyone couldn't be sat together. And it helped get people to know each other. When we're talking about people, it made them feel at ease, and also just quick decisions, let's be informal. This can just sort of often be misinterpreted quite a bit as, okay, so you go on the piss. But actually what we're saying here is that creating a scene where we sort of eat out together, especially in the early days, it helps with getting to know each other. Even in the office, you can imagine an office where there's 9 people together, they've just been thrown together, none of them know each other, and then you can literally hear a pin drop. So us being able to just eat out, do a bit of fact finding on each other, get to know people in the team was quite a big deal. And we incorporated that with the Agile Sheffield group, which is one that I co-host 35 miles. I was going to say that way. I think I'm left-handed and naturally look to the left. I couldn't tell you which direction Sheffield is from here. I digress. So let the team do the work was actually, okay, there's some problems that we can solve, and we always will try and block stuff. Just a simple informal conversation round a board in the team. But actually, there were some problems, especially in government, where we actually need an escalation route. And Andy, who actually helped us set up the hub initially, was great for that in terms of making connections, not just with the Home Office digital guys in London and the operational side of the business, but with other government departments as well. So we're looking to do some shared services stuff with people like DWP and HMRC. So the idea is, if you as a end user, as an applicant of some sort of application to government, if you've provided all this detail once, maybe it's around your tax, maybe it's around your family, your work, why are you having to provide it again? We've got that information. So a smarter way of sort of joining up government is to sort of break down some of those barriers cross government into different departments. So let the team do the work was flag it and have a quick escalation route so that the guys could carry on coding and they weren't sort of distracted by any political pressures. Transparency, so comes into play with the whole culture thing and everything that we said, but this was all around being open. if you got too much work on, if you were getting a hesitancy to maybe you looking like you might start multitasking, okay, flag it up. But also let's visualize all work. I think it's always a challenge. The different sort of companies I've gone around and worked with, especially over the last couple of years, there's always a tendency for just some bits of work or pockets somewhere to be kept to one side or not disclosed, maybe if it's a political reason or somebody has an agenda. But a key thing here was we wanted to visualize everything. So even some of we sort of wanted to show how we were delivering, but all the other stuff that was taking place at the bottom, all the scoping stuff that was happening around user experience, some of the metrics we wanted to collect, how important that was. So that can take up people's time. It can also help flag that classic problem of how do you sort of scope now whilst you're delivering? How do you scope what's coming next whilst you're delivering now and find time to do that? So transparency helps that, because the first problem is being able to see the problem, right? Yeah. And finally, forgetting about job titles. This relates back to the whole flat structure thing, and everybody has a voice. So if we're in a discussion about maybe a delivery solution, we'd want people on the user experience side to be able to contribute. Similarly, if we wanted to look at the feasibility of some wireframes, I've seen it before where you get too siloed and you don't involve developers early enough in being able to review how big things are, how feasible they are, is there another way? But this was a massive thing for us. It was just, of course everybody knows what they're there to do in their own role, but we sort of value them as an individual with an opinion rather than the sum of the parts along the bottom. So, culture and values, all very good, very overarching and key to everything we do. This was a hand-drawn sketch when I'm sort of starting to work with the team and we're looking at, okay, that's great, but what are all these elements are we going to sort of choose and combine to define our way of working? So we sort of split it up, and you could do it by a lot of ways. With all the user and requirement stuff, so you've got a range of, okay, defining who your users are, what personas they are, so you might start with user groups and you might split it out. Have you got a current journey that you're looking to improve on? How we're starting to shape a backlog. Let's define what's going to be ready to even go on a board. Let's define what's done. How we sort of test things throughout, that's another, we'll get onto that later on, that's another challenge for us. And then metrics, okay, so the government, a lot of the online application forms will publish a lot of, and it's to do with transparency, they'll publish a lot of metrics. So if you wanted to look at how many student applicants are applying in their current curriculum year, or you wanted to split that by different demographics, there's now a way of servicing that information all online. There's a crazy amount, maybe even gone too overboard, but I think unless we get user feedback, we'll not actually know by the public, who was the end user. So service design metrics are a big deal, and that word's coming up a lot even more. It seems to have morphed wider out of what was user experience to just forget about not just tunneling ourselves to what's on an interface, what's somebody's journey, whether that's they're rocking up wanting to do something in an airport and what experience they have there after having an online journey. It's the whole end-to-end of the start to finish, what somebody does to be able to get to where they want to be. Boards, so we were going to have a talk tonight about boards, but it actually needed quite a lot more room. As Glenn will know, it's the thing I'm very fascinated in, and I like to get stuck in and do some activities around boards. So maybe that's a future thing if we just get the logistics right. But this list here sort of, okay, shows what was the brain dump of mine and the team's head of what's our workflow. So end to end, forgetting about noddy to do doing dones, which we all may start with somewhere. But what's the end to end value stream? What's the way we're going to work? Which features of Kanban would be valuable? So there's things like WIP limits, queues, policies mentioned there. How to blend Kanban with Scrum? Do we want to? And you get different mixtures of, and it gets misused quite a lot when people say Scrum Ban. But to me, essentially, I'm a big fan of Kanban boards because they visualize an end-to-end workflow. But a lot of the key events we do in teams now are known as Scrum events because that's where they tended to surface from. So stand-ups, retrospectives, demos, those types of activity. Sprint length, sprint at all, question mark, stand-ups, how we visualize, how we're getting on, adaptive planning, burn-up charts, swarming blockers, a new one on me that was called a waste snake, which is a very valuable idea around every time that you get a distraction, for those who've not heard of it like me, something that takes you off some work you've maybe committed to, you flag that on the board and you make this funny snake type object when all these things sort of add up and you get a list of post-its. And I guess they're quite valuable in retrospectives then because you can actually flag, okay, we had this much unplanned work / distractions. Team events, quite a few standard ones on there. Also feedback loops, so how we would collectively own things and how we'd self-organise. Mentioned the inception day, but then getting a team workspace. So aside from a board, it was key to us to also have a space where the team could visualise their work. They could maybe visualise an impact map, sort of look if they were doing some discovery of, okay, what are all the drivers, why are we actually even working on this, what are the business goals, who are they actually for, what are the personas, so that in one area you could sort of walk into it and get a real feel for, this is this team's area, this is their identity, and this is what they're going to deliver, who they're doing it for. And I've talked too long and not forgot to take this off. So tech stuff, a bit loosely titled there, maybe shows I'm not a coder at heart unless you wanted some really bad dated HTML, here if anyone's interested. So we were looking at, okay, what tools do we use to do behaviour driven development? Pairing, do we do it, when do we do it, is there any sort of line with that? Build and continuous integration, code reviews, stuff like environments. We were just setting up from scratch here, so we got absolutely nothing. It was key that we had to build a lot of relationships with London guys in terms of a help us please. So being able to get an instance of AWS pretty quickly, making relationships with the DevOps team in London, all this was really important stuff, but at this stage, you know, we'd not sort of even got a fridge or a conference phone, so a bit challenging. And then we started to look at, okay, this challenge of government and GDS, and rightly so, is very user-centered. So we got all this key stuff around here, around how we capture user needs, what are some of the activities, and then how that funnels into how we're getting ready to deliver stuff. Then we have the challenge of, okay, what's coming through the funnel, how do we split stuff if it's too big, and how do we prioritise what we do delivery. This isn't something you don't see very often, and I guess people will misinterpret it as a planning meeting, but how we kick off delivery as well, which we'll get onto. Ways we code, okay, small stories, being able to demo stuff frequently, frequent check-ins, being able to visualise code coverage, how we test and how we release. So this was a part of getting out of that government culture of not getting into glossy PowerPoints. This was a, let's get some people's ideas out here and let's use this. Okay, we're not going to keep it looking like a fag packet thing forever, but it gets people's ideas out and it gets some quick collaboration and some feedback. So we started to talk about this quite a bit, and then it got to stages where, geez, should we just start delivering and we'll tweak it? Because yeah, let's remember that that's what Agile's all about, that we can actually improve as we go. So we started to get stuck in and work on our first product. So some of these techniques and practices that we chose, so you'll see some sort of common variations on stuff that you already know, and then you might see some new ideas as well, but these were all drilled in a layer from that overarching approach sketch that I've shown you. Okay, so we were focusing around people. We got some people from the sort of permanent, who were civil servants essentially, permanent from the operational side of the business. And one of the perks that I wasn't aware of seems to be you can do these crazy shift patterns where somebody can be doing 7 while 3 and somebody can be doing 10 while 6. And it took a bit of getting used to because, we needed some sort of core hours of working. So we said that everyone would be in the office between 10 and 4, but we didn't want to take away that the sort of shift pattern that worked around people's lives, because people might have, for a very good reason, work 10 while 6. So we planned a stand-up that worked for everyone. So my gut instinct would always be, why can't we have a stand-up first thing? But this was around the group of people we got together. And so we did stand-ups at 10 a.m. And I'll show you a little later on why that actually works for us and how we sort of adapted to use that in our favour. A key thing, I guess, you see it quite a bit, but we had just a question of, does everyone need to hear it? So this classic scenario, I don't know if you've been in it yourselves, where there's maybe 10 of you stood round and you get into sometimes you go off at a crazy tangent, sometimes 2 people get into this crazy debate, and you get people looking at the floor, or they start looking at their phone, and it's just an obvious smell of, okay, why is everyone hearing this? So we just got into a culture of having little huddles, and I just had a little post-it thing of post-stand-up chats that I'd very actively attempt to jot whilst we sort of flagged stuff as we went along. But that way it meant that the people who needed to hear it probably had a bit more of an in-depth discussion amongst the people who they could get good feedback from. Nobody was demotivated because they were listening to something. So at this early stage, we were keeping stand-ups to 10 minutes, and that worked for us. Questions wall. So because we were in a big office, we were a start-up, we didn't have loads of people who knew just logistically how things worked in the public sector. So we got stuff on there. We encouraged everybody to write questions. Everybody can get that sort of out. And we had like a 10-minute session. It was at first at the end of every day, and it became a half-an-hour session at the end of every week, just to gather everyone round, a quick shout out, who can answer it. It might be, how do we get a bloody fridge? Because, people are having to eat out all the time. Or it might be if we need access to home office GitLab, how do we do that? What's the quickest way to do it without blocking anyone? So we call this story time. So I mentioned the 10 a.m. stand-up that we had. So for some people, they might have been in at sort of 8:30, 8:45, so it would be logical, whilst their mind was still fresh and not bogged down, to be able to have a stand-up straight away and crack on. We couldn't do that, and we decided to do a 10 a.m. stand-up. So what we did as part of story time was, on our first product, we got like a journey maps that had got, you see very slightly these little yellow bits, which are all the stories along the journey. And we tackled any, this is Brian, our B8, and Max, who's our developer, and we tackled any problems we got, any queries with any existing scope, anything that maybe an acceptance criteria wasn't quite clear on a story, which very rarely was in the current iteration, but actually we'd got that sort of 8:30 till 10 buffer of, we're going to use this time to help clear up any queries of scoping what's coming next. So we'd use it to do any scoping of, say iteration 1, we're working in right now. We'd do story time on the iteration 2 stories to firm them up, so that in a week's time we wouldn't be caught out cold and we'd not have a load of stories that weren't ready. So it worked in our favour because we'd do 8:30 while 10, that they do that if it was needed. If not, it may be finishing doing some coding. But once 10 o'clock came, we'd be chatting about, okay, what we're doing in delivery, full refresh, get our mind back in that, and then for the rest of the day we were in the current delivery iteration. Of course there's odd urgent moments where we need to know something, and it's not always as ideal as that, but that's just an example of how we helped let that sort of amount of time go by and not waste it before the 10 o'clock stand up. Story kickoff. So I guess any people who are into behaviour-driven development maybe recognise this little cluster of disciplines, the three amigos, but instead of writing features given when thens as you would in BDD, this was actually just a quick sort of 15-minute max sanity check before we started each story. So it was to just make sure that we'd looked at things from all angles, any questions would come out, and basically even if we'd done a planning session 3 or 4 days ago, it was just to get that instant refresh and that collaborative way of working, and people maybe even remembering stuff from the planning session that the person coding didn't, really helped kick off stories and ensure there's no questions or lack of understanding. Sketching sessions, basically, especially if we were looking at a journey or sketching out something architecturally, maybe not as badly as that, but it was used just as a let's not get into email trails, let's not get into big formal glossy documents. If we want to figure something out, we've hired smart people, let's get them together and let's sketch it out. It's quick, it's informal, it's face to face, there's no lack of understanding. Pairing, the XP duo. So around pair programming, I've heard a lot of and seen a lot of positives and negatives of it. I've had always a really positive experience of it. What we said here though is just let's do it at discretion. Again, these people are smart guys and they don't need to say, look, we're doing pairing, period. They can work it out. They'd always, even if they weren't pairing, they'd be doing little demos to each other once they maybe finished a piece of work anyway. So, in the early days, we're talking first couple of weeks before we got a lot of infrastructure and access stuff set up, we'd be in that sort of old school scenario where Dave, our developer there, would be doing a manual deploy and just shouting over the fence to Brian, but we'd get a lot of instant communication and basically he would just demo it straight away, just that quick validation. I see it so many times when that isn't done. It might be we've communicated it, great, a tester's got it, but actually, why not do it here? It's fresh in his mind, he's not context switching, he's not sending his mind to sleep on that thing to then open his mind up from sleep on something else. So whilst it was instant and fresh in his head, we might validate it. Sometimes we'd spot a bug instantly that maybe when you're coding it and you're that close to it, you'd not even seen it. So we found that as a very useful activity, quick informal demos. Removing blockers, okay. This was something that we would flag on top of tickets on a board. So we'd stick if it was a blocker, a big pink sticky would go over there. And a key thing there as well for retrospectives would be to put a start and end date on it. This why, because once we'd remove the blocker, we'd envelope it up, and then in a retrospective, we'd sort of cluster stuff that was similar. If it's stuff to do with environments, deploys, infrastructure, maybe there's a pattern there. Maybe there's something that we've been that bogged down in this current iteration we've not seen. So this helps us spot problems and escalate things quickly. User theme rooms. Ideally, we'd have the sort of biggest ever open office space to be able to show things, because I'm always a bit skeptical of rooms, especially like team rooms where people are totally cordoned off. But this user theme room was more an experience without sounding a bit cheesy. So you could walk into the world of Rahid, who was a student who was 22, coming over from India, and was a bit dismayed. He wanted to get his application through as quickly as possible. Dismayed that we sent everything by letter, there was no electronic communication. And we get some of these persona boards as well as like journeys and activity maps just up in the room. So the idea was you walk into it, you can get your head into what this piece of work's about, what product we're trying to deliver here, what's the current pain points, who our users are. Be inclusive, a bit misleading the picture because I was actually getting at, basically we chucked the pen round here for everybody to update the burn up chart, but this was just so that they had basically a vested interest. Everybody was thinking about what we're delivering. As we all are when we're in an iteration, it's quite time focused, and basically we just wanted everybody to be involved and not just, if I say facilitated a stand-up, I didn't just want to be the person doing that, because then it'd almost like I'd be the traditional project manager that was sort of tutting if we were away from this line. Okay, so as you'd expect with people getting together this quickly, when we formed, a lot of airs and graces. There was still sort of some formalities there. When people did start to get to know each other, that's great, but they can express themselves a lot more, and what you actually get is you then sort of get this stormy period where people are feeling really comfortable, but how much of it's a good thing and a bad thing, and you get a bit of a happy medium where we've got over the let's get our views out, let's get everything on the table, and we start to get into this norming stage. I'd say 6 months on, we're probably halfway through there. I think the thing about Agile and just improving our ways of working is that we've got to be sort of pretty humble, and we've not got to have any self-preservation. I spend every day, like I'll look at it the last day, the day just gone, and just think, well, I could do that better if I did that tomorrow. And I've probably been thinking that for about 10 years. And depending on who you speak to, some people think that's really shit. It's like, wow, you're not catching on. But actually, the fact is, the improvement is like infinite. So the goal is that we'll get towards that stage. We don't use it as a particular benchmark, but I find it interesting, just the interactions of people, especially when they're sort of thrown together, how they get on and how they solve problems. So learn fast and improve. So part of this, as I said, when we jumped in with our ways of working, was actually we could spend ages discussing it, but until we do it, we're not going to actually know. So we found a couple of things that helped shape us along the way. Having that constant feedback on a small team, and the sort of environment where you can hear a pin drop. You are sort of forced to communicate in a way, and it's good that not just at retrospectives we sort of see a change and we make it straight away. So at first we had a couple of avatars for each team member, but then it was no good because we found out it was just encouraging them to context switch. And so we said, well, yeah, but we're getting a second team on board now, and that person might need to do a bit of work from that person. Okay, well, we said if they're going to be split like that, we're going to have a team availability tracker, and it's a lot less formal than it sounds. It's essentially just sketching all the names of people on the team board for the next 2 weeks and putting if they're on holiday, if they're on another team, or if they're currently in Sheffield on this piece of work. So they'd have one avatar, it'd be on the board of the work that they were working on. The other item, if it was still ongoing, there'd be a trade-off decision. They could either complete the initial item or it would have a blocker on it. But that encouraged no context switching and actually being able to flow stuff. So we're getting to a stage now where more product opportunities have come along, and we're actually looking at the key aim of this was to recruit a permanent capability. So we started out with some permanent people, but quite contractor heavy. Part of the challenge of that is the crazy security clearance process and the length of that to actually get permanent people on board. Whereas contractors are okay to an extent, but they have to be escorted everywhere. I had the experience yesterday in London. Feels a bit weird. But the aim is to recruit this permanent base. So we're now in a stage where we're looking at a trade-off between getting permanent people in, which we've just had a recruitment drive and got 15 people who are coming in to join, which doesn't sound massive, but there's still only 12 of us there, so if they all turned up at once, it would be a shock. Or is the cost of delay on some of the products coming in the portfolio, is the cost of delay too much that we might have to actually ramp up a team quickly with a mix of permanent and contract staff? So I think we're starting this week, and I'd love this to have been a few days later to show it, is London have got one, but just having our own portfolio Kanban board. So being in a position to map the sort of key GDS phrases, if you like, and have like pipeline stuff that's coming up, or a contender, discovery, alpha, private beta, public beta, live, which is the sort of life cycle under GDS. And this would show basically how we can match demand to supply, basically, and it'll force decisions if we've got a lot of stuff stacked up on the backlog on the left-hand side of the portfolio board. What we're starting to do is sort of get some senior stakeholders involved as well and force that decision making. Let's get away from the sort of traditional government thing, the perception of public service, around, okay, you have program boards and steering groups to decide everything and they're minuted. Let's get a portfolio board that shows the flow, that shows everything on it, all pieces of work, so it's like a zoomed out view of a team board. Let's force that decision making there and get them involved. I'm not saying it's easy, but we're starting to make some good ground with that at the moment. Where next? So, GDS, as I've mentioned, gives a good process overview of how you deliver a service. They call it a service design manual. So what we've been doing recently is actually challenging GDS and saying, okay, at the end of each of these phases, we get why we're doing the phases. We do discovery just to make sure we're not going to waste our time. But actually, assessments at the end of each phase, we're challenging them to say, okay, they maybe started out as assessment as a couple of questions to make sure you're on the right track and a 30-minute interview. Let's ensure that they don't become stage gates, because then we're back to where we were with Waterfall, but just with maybe a bit of a fancier name. So that's a challenge we've got. GDS is very user-centered, as it should be. I think it does a lot right in that space, but in the spirit of Agile, GDS will look to work with them to improve basically the way that we deliver products and services. So, bringing it back into people, so what we found, and it's probably cemented in my head stuff, is that Agile is about being human, which sounds daft, but it is treating people like people, not hierarchies and job titles. And it's not about resources or subordinates. A resource is a bit of machinery or a computer or a bit of kit that you buy. And subordinates is a bit of a euphemism for servants maybe, but essentially people are not subordinates. Okay, and it's about these people being able to solve problems for other people, not tied to a job role. And most importantly, I think when we see Agile, it is a bit of a label. It's something a lot of us have come to love working in that way. But let's remember that it's not an end game, it's a stepping stone. We're going on this continuous journey of improving the way we're working, So we don't know what comes next. Maybe people are starting to have ideas, even in the last few years, with stuff around mob programming, a lot more in the continuous delivery space. We're starting to see what could shape up coming next, but let's just not treat Agile as a thing that's fixed. Because 15 years ago, when a lot of this was all defined, we didn't have anywhere near, if you think of yourself as a customer, a user, consumer, we didn't have anywhere near the amount of demand that we'd have from an organisation. We didn't know we'd be able to track, we'd expect to track and see parcels by the minute. I didn't know I'd be able to know the name of the dude who's cooking my pizza in Domino's. You know, we've changed our expectations as a society, and so Agile shouldn't be fixed where it was in 2001. So we should keep evolving and look what's coming next. And a key thing, it's become very much a label, and there's a lot of myths around, probably because of that. But we're essentially talking about effective ways of working and not buzzwords or trends. So it's just about getting better and keeping improving. But you'll do that if you treat your people right. So a few influences. So I mentioned how we've blended some of these things. So we worked a lot with Kanban boards, Scrum events, maybe rediscovered some XP practices, and learnt a lot from some anecdotal stuff, like Mr. Nyberg's Lean from the Trenches. But also, these guys in the middle, they've had a lot of ideas of their own. So as we look to get a permanent capability on board, what we want to become is sort of slick in our ways of working and be able to talk about that and convey that to a number of permanent people who walk through the door fresh. And that's where you can find out more about Home Office Digital and what we're doing. That's myself, and my brand is nimbleapproach.com, where I move around and work with a lot of different companies, from startups to government folk. Thank you for your time.